Hi, I'm Tod Davies. I'm the editorial director of Exterminating Angel Press, and I'm the author of the History of Arcadia visionary fiction series. So you will not be surprised to know that the title of my talk is Beyond Imperialism, Visionary Fiction and the End of the Hero. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to kind of roll through it. Some of you probably have read The Waning of the Middle Ages by Johann Hunsinger, who's an incredible writer. And he says that since 250 BC, Western culture has oscillated between a choice of a heroic mode of being, which he says involves domination, hierarchy, individual triumph, and what he calls a bucolic mode of being, which involves kindness, mutual aid, and care of nature. I kind of don't like to call it bucolic. I kind of like to call it Arcadian, unsurprisingly, since my books are called The History of Arcadia. Because when we hear the word bucolic, we kind of go, oh, that's not as good as heroic. And that, I'm going to argue, is part of the problem and has been historically part of the problem. Because when we look at all the isms, I mean, we're looking at imperialism today, but it's linked, obviously, to capitalism, colonialism, racism, and sexism. And they all depend on a heroic mode of being. Every single one of them. Every single one of them depends on the individual triumphing. Every single one of them depends on, and this is really important, sending the trash that the individual makes downriver to some other group. Obviously, imperialism is about, and colonialism are about finding new places to send your trash downriver to. Sexism is about finding a sex to send all of your weaknesses onto. Racism, same thing. Racism is about sending all of your insecurities down to another race and saying it's them who are having the problem, it's not me, I'm a hero, right? So, and Edward Said points this out. He says that that culture and imperialism need the power to narrate or block other narratives from forming, other than the narrative that the hero at the top is the most important and the person or institution that everyone needs to support without question, right? So at the base of all of our cultural norms is story. That's my thing. That's why I'm a publisher. That's why I'm a writer, because my assessment is that what we do in our individual lives is moved by what stories we're telling ourselves. And as individuals, we make up the culture. And the culture is moved by the story that it's telling itself. So we have to look at the story that we're telling ourselves in order to make a change. A really good example of a heroic mode of being and kind of a caricature of it, I don't know if anybody ever saw this years ago, a film called 300, which was supposed to be a film about a war, a battle in ancient Greece between, I think it was Sparta and Athens. Anyway, I'm watching it with a friend of mine, and he loves this film. And these guys are marching through the landscape, and I say, who's carrying their luggage? And he says, they're living off the land. And I say, who's doing their laundry? And he says, they're living off the land. And I say, are they giving anything back to the land? And that's the heroic mode of being. These guys are marching, we're not even asking any questions about who's digging their latrines, who's feeding them, who's growing their food, who's taking care of their needs, who gave birth to them, none of that. It's just the heroes marching across the landscape to go to war. Now, there's a very, very famous book about this, and there is a wonderful book that has just been written in riposte to that. The really famous book, which is truly a classic, is The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell, right? Which is an analysis, and a wonderful analysis, of the hero myth that we all tell ourselves, that underlies just about everything that we say, especially in the mass media. There's been a riposte to that, and while I was thinking about this talk, the book came out, thank you Maria Tatar, The Heroine with 1,001 Faces, right? A really good book, and also points to how the hero myth is so firmly embedded in us. Because Joseph Campbell, it's interesting, when you read it now, you are still, it was one of the foundational books for me, and I was incredibly impressed by, as everybody who reads that book is, by the scholarship and by his integration of the scholarship into a continuous narrative. Fantastic, right? When I was rereading it this time, I'm still impressed by all those things, but it also seems old-fashioned. True, it does say, oh, women can follow this path that we have laid down culturally for the hero as well, and women do, and he gives examples. But his heart's not in it. His heart is in thinking that, quote unquote, woman is life, and she is the prize that the hero wins when the hero brings back the boon after somebody else has done his laundry and dug his latrines and given birth to him and all those things. When Maria Tatar is writing her book, The Heroine with 1,001 Faces, she goes back and looks at the history of heroines, and she talks about heroines in Western culture, and she talks about new stories about heroines. She points out that when she's talking about these heroines who we're seeing now, they are pretty much female versions of heroes. They take revenge. They have no feelings. It's not really what I would call the Arcadian mode of being, right? So I think where we make a mistake is it's not a split between men and women. It really is a split between what Hunsinger talked about, which is between the heroic and the Arcadian. You need both. You definitely need both. But what has happened to us since 250 BC, I would actually argue maybe going back all the way to 2500 BC, is that we have started to give the heroic, we've valorized the heroic, we've given it more and more power, and we have left out the Arcadian. Think about it. We think fairy tales are childish. Fairy tales tend to be Arcadian. Fairy tales are not childish. Fairy tales are foundational to our biological being, actually, since story is biology and fairy tales are also biology. Now, Michael Herrington, the activist Michael Herrington, there was an article, a really interesting article in September's Commonweal about him, where it points out that he was really about the fact that socialism can never be built from the top down. It has to be built from the bottom up. There's a really good reason for this, which is that top-down structures eventually have to fail because of the fact that all the little bits will get more and more complicated. It will get harder and harder to control, and eventually it will just collapse. Whereas a bottom-up structure grows organically as part of the web of life and automatically adjusts itself. So, and what Herrington apparently said was that what we've got now is a predatory culture of a zero-sum game where only one person or one group can win and the others can't. And he says that predatory culture at the expense of others has got to stop if socialism is to actually get any traction. So what we need is different voices. We need the story to change. We need the story to change to accept all these different voices and move to an increased Arcadian mode of kindness, mutual aid, and care of nature. Obviously, we're in a transition right now. It's an emergency. This is a historic period for humanity, which is unfortunate. I personally would rather be living in, what is it the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times, and that's a curse. And we are definitely living in interesting times. So you can see everywhere that the story is changing. Green shoots are pushing up everywhere. And you can see that the story of the hero has reached an airless dead end. And all you have to do is look at Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and their supposed competition to be the richest and biggest idiot in the world, in my opinion. It's ridiculous. Bezos going into space. 50 years ago, as a culture, we went into space. Don't you have something better to spend your money on? But he is really caught up in the hero mode of being, in the hero legend. He's going to be the hero, right? There are so many stories in our culture that say what's going to happen to us if we go on like this. Faust, what happens to Faust? Goethe's Faust is a very, very good map of how you cannot go on like this. Ibsen's Peer Gynt, another one. You can't be shut up in a bung of self forever. We're seeing new voices come up, and we're seeing elites freak out about it. Black Lives Matter, people freaking out about all these voices coming up through Black Lives Matter. The Me Too movement, all the stories of gender fluidity are causing quite a lot of freak out at the top. And I completely get why the young are much more into gender fluidity. We have to be more into gender fluidity because we've also separated the sexes in terms of heroic and Arcadian, male and female, and that's incorrect as well. That you want to be a whole person in a whole society. That's what we're aiming for. And imperialism, capitalism, they all say, no, you are a cog in a structure rather than the structure being for you as a human. So there are lots of stories. N.K. Jemisin is writing science fiction from a different point of view. Fantastic stuff. Walida and Marisha and Adrienne Marie Brown are, and they're the ones who coined the phrase visionary fiction to mean fiction that envisions worlds which are more socially just. I expand it to say fiction that envisions worlds where we explore and become more fully human, each one of us. As I said, we're in a time of transition and emergency, and it always happens in times of transition and emergency in Western culture that fairy tales, fantasy, science fiction comes to the fore, usually with people saying, oh, that's too childish, we shouldn't be listening to that. But for example, at the start of the Industrial Revolution and the huge upheavals that took place there, Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein when she's 19 years old. And I have a lot to say about Frankenstein, but I won't say it now because we don't have time. At the breakup of the Middle Ages, the King Arthur stories, the stories of the Grail, they all come to the fore. At the World War I and World War II, you have Tolkien. You have Tolkien writing Lord of the Rings. You have C.S. Lewis writing all of his work. You have Charles Williams writing his visionary fiction. You also have, then in the terror of the atomic era, you have Ursula K. Le Guin writing. Compare The Word for the World is Forest, her book, with Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is in heroic domination mode. Word for the World of Forest is in bucolic or Arcadian form. So I'm going to close by quoting Joseph Campbell, actually. He said, every failure to cope with a life situation must be laid in the end to a restriction of consciousness. Okay, every failure. We are definitely at a point where we are realizing that we have failed. Or if not failed, we have at least come to the end of a particular road and we have to take another road. We are locked in a room. We are locked in an airless room, or what Ibsen would call the bung of self. And it's time to get out of that bung of self. It's time to get out of that airless room, get out into the forest, and join back in the web of life. So thank you, and thank you so much to the World-Ecology Research Network. I so enjoyed the last conference I was at. I'm so sorry we don't get to meet in person this time, but this is great anyway, and any way we can do it. So lots of love to everybody, nice things to eat, and I'm looking forward to being on my panel. Thanks.